So the next two speakers I would like to introduce are Mary Claire Buell and Doran Ritchie. Mary Claire Buell is completing her PhD at Trent University at the School of the Environment. She has previously worked for the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry at the Wawa office, which is along Lake Superior, as a biologist. Doran Ritchie is from Saugeen First Nation, Ojibway First Nation, and has previously worked as a bear technician and fish and wildlife technician for the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry as well, and is currently the manager for infrastructure and resources for the Saugeen First Nation. So they've both walked away from the, happily walked away from the government side of things and look to serve interests elsewhere. So I'd like to introduce the two to the talk.
No, I think we're good. Okay.
Thanks, Stephen. So yeah, I'm Mary Claire from Trent, and I'll let my coworker say hi as well.
Ani bonjour, Kiwi-Taswa and Indigenous, Saugeen Binjba, Makwan Nodem. I just want to say thank you. I introduced myself. My given name is Doran Ritchie. My spiritual name is Spirits from All Around. I just want to take just one quick second just to acknowledge the first peoples of this land. We've been here since time immemorial. I also want to thank the Creator and the ancestors for the opportunity that we've had today, and also acknowledge the elder that spoke this morning, Chimigwech.
Thanks, Doran. So today we want to speak to you guys about our relationship working on a water quality issue in the Saugeen Ojibway Nation territory. So we'll start with some background on the community whose territory our project overlaps.
So this is the Saugeen Ojibway Nation traditional territory. There's over 2 million acres. That's outlined in green. In this area, we have ownership to the lake bed as well. There's two outstanding land claims right now, one for in yellow, the Saugeen Peninsula, and then the Aboriginal title claim and then the claim to the lake bed. So we're going to be touching base on a project that's here in Owen Sound Harbor. And again, there's some of the treaties there. Other people would like to read it, just come and speak to me afterwards, and I can share this information with you. So the Saugeen Ojibway Nation is actually comprised of two communities, and I'll just go back to this map here. Chippewas of Nawash Unceded First Nation, Chiefs Point and Saugeen First Nation, that's my home community. Collectively, we're known as the Saugeen Ojibway Nation. Our traditional territory is called Anishinaabe King, where we've exercised our right to harvest, hunt, gather, and protect. And we're the only non-coastal First Nation in North America with the commercial fishing right to the fishery in that map outlined in blue.
So this is just essentially the same map, but just gray. You can see the peninsula up there, and we're in the Great Lakes area. For those of you who aren't familiar with Ontario geography, Lake Huron. And what came up within that territory is Owen Sound Bay, so the one that's pointed to the bottom arrow there. Their inner harbor, so right where the city is heavily contaminated from historical industrial development. And currently, Transport Canada is wanting to divest that harbor, and with the intent of doing work in that harbor so that they can bring in bigger vessels, so potentially dredging. But there's incredible concern about what are the ecological risks, what are the even human health risks of stirring up these legacy contaminants. And so the Saugeen Ojibway Nation Environment Office, who Doran's with, we're seeking out experts that can help them tackle understanding what is the pollution, and what does it mean in terms of fish health in particular because of the commercial fishing rights, but also the health of the environment as a whole and the health of this lake or bay. So my supervisor, Chris Metcalf, and I were brought onto the project to try to tackle this issue. Now, I wanted to show you guys, this is a classic, like summarized framework of how toxicologists tackle sediment contaminant issues. We have these three sort of major components. You identify what you're worried about, define what you want to achieve in terms of ecosystem quality, and use a whole bunch of different processes like modeling and things to understand where you're going to study. And then you develop how you're going to study the site. And we like to collect all this scientific evidence, which we call lines of evidence, and eventually those get weighed and we output a recommendation or a decision on how to manage the environment or what are the risks of these pollutants. So I have here, just from the very beginning, this process comes with a colonial, settler, Western science perspective. How we identify critical receptors, define ecosystem quality, and figure out the system as a whole we bring forward our worldview and how we approach our science. Like the keynote speaker who was talking, everyone does science, but how we do it is heavily influenced by our worldview. So I have in purple here sort of what I've come to learn as I grew up through the system as a settler person, how you tackle that. So for example, critical receptors could be species at risk, things that are in legislation. But I'm going to pop up these green spheres. So I've worked with Indigenous communities for over 7 years now, and from my learning from Doran and other community members that I've worked with, I've come to realize that those spheres that influence how we even tackle risk assessment in the environment don't cover off. I have these circles overlapping because I think some things do cross over, but there are other approaches that we need to come into how we tackle these issues. So for example, critical receptors might be species of cultural significance for medicine, ceremony. How we define ecosystem quality doesn't have to just be on what kind of services the ecosystem provides us, but our relationship to the ecosystem, past, present, and future, looking at that. And even how we look at the ecosystem as a whole. We do all this modeling and make all these predictions, but there's thousands of years of oral histories and understanding of the land that our models can't touch in terms of how we can understand what's going on. So this is just some of what I've learned. I obviously can't speak on behalf of Indigenous people and their worldview, but I wanted to bring up some of the circles or something in these circles that you guys can kind of see where we're going with this. So the other problem with that framework is very hierarchical and there's no relationality with it. And so we wanted to tackle this issue in Owen Sound by starting to work together and have each step go back and reflect and influence what our next step would be. So it started with identifying community need for understanding the risk of these contaminants and building a partnership and team of scientific experts, community experts, knowledge holders to tackle this issue. And then, click, we use both knowledge systems to design the investigation and select how we're going to tackle the issues. So everything from site selection came from Doran, from other knowledge holders of the territory. We tackled understanding what was going to happen to whitefish, since that's such a culturally important species. And one of the most important things is while we were in the field together, we were doing that together. We were in the lab, we were doing that together. We were doing community workshops, gathering knowledge and mapping, we're doing that together. So as a scientist, I'm understanding the community side of the information they're producing, and as a community member, now they're understanding the science that's happening too, or the Western science that's happening, so that it's easier to exchange knowledge if you're experiencing collecting it together. So this is just a blown up version of what's in the middle of the slide, the next slide there. So I kind of touched on all these, so I'm just going to blast past that. There's Doran down in the corner. I think he got a sunburn that day. Yeah. Yeah. And then so the next little part that pops on this slide here is these are pictures actually from another presentation I've given, but those are essentially the lines of evidence that we collected. We did some experiments in the lab, in the field, workshops and mapping, and then ultimately we're at a stage where we're evaluating the risk of these contaminants. So if you want to, and I'll let Doran speak to the next stage of this process.
Yeah, and so in terms of next steps, the evidence that was provided to date from both the community and Trent University, supported a few number of key issues that we ultimately got in contact with the Minister of Transport. One, with respect to the divestiture process, no further steps should be taken until we answer three of the following questions: the further research on the full extent of the contamination, the impact on aquatic life and the health of the water quality, and of course the remediation and the impact of the fishing rights. So we talked about lake whitefish. We use that as an indicator species because our ancestors tell us that historically the lake whitefish were so abundant you could walk on the water, and that is the species of greatest concern to the Saugeen Ojibway Nation. So we use that rather than just have a Western science model for any fish. But of course, we needed to get into the communities and not just our own First Nations communities, but this is a broader issue. It's about water quality and safety. In terms of the status of the harbor right now, I can't speak as much to this, but it's on par in terms of the contamination levels of areas that have that designation of an area of concern within the Great Lakes. What we're trying to push the federal government is to basically do it once and do it right. And there was a comment that both Mary Claire and I are happily moved on from the provincial government. I can personally attest to that. 6 months after I started my career with Saugeen Ojibway Nation, my former colleagues and I had met to discuss this project, the rehabilitation of this very large dam. It's also a sea lamprey barrier control mechanism. That led into about a year and a half of very intense negotiations. Ultimately, the Crown failed to consult with Saugeen Ojibway Nation. They were calling it a construction project, an upgrade. It was infringing on every single right that we used to defend our claim and our right to exist. And that led into, again, very expensive legal bills, failed negotiations, and all throughout a frustrated and a failed process. About a year and a half later, this is an example of doing it once and doing it right. The Great Lakes Fisheries Commission reached out to Saugeen Ojibway Nation. We shared our story with them. We said we don't oppose the project, but we need to answer our questions together with the community. So Saugeen Ojibway Nation and the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission met, and we started the discussion on a strong, constructive, collaborative relationship with one common interest. That's the benefit of the community and the benefit of the fishery overall in Lake Huron. We talked about financial resources. We talked about collaboration on every level, the planning, designing, engineering, construction. We had our community monitors out there. We did archaeology assessments. We did our own independent aquatic studies, shared that information with the DFO and the commission. And we took a year and a half to consult our communities. We did a land use and occupancy study. We documented every bit of knowledge that we can gather from the community. And we started that off without the idea of going in to say, we're going to do this project. We went in with the approach to say, this is what's before us, community. Here's the information that we have. Now we want to hear from you. We'll provide the resources for that. In the long-term scope, basically, we actually did fundamentally change the scope of that EA to reflect the knowledge that our community members had. And at the end of the day, it was a unanimous decision of favor for the rehabilitation and reconstruction of that sea lamprey barrier. So in the end, we walked away with full community support consent that was funded, and the communities got to basically design the scope of what they would refer to as an environmental assessment. And that's a very keen example of doing it once and doing it right. Definitely was as a lesson for the ministry to take a hold of. And so we're very proud of that. And I know I could probably get into a very long presentation about the specifics of that, but those are just the high-level key points that I wanted to touch base on. So that's it from me. MC. And again, that's the message that we wanted to convey today, is that, you know, on every level, if you do it once, you do it right. I don't think I've been in too many situations where communities have absolutely said no. It's about the sharing of information, working collaboratively with our science partners and knowledge holders.
Thank you.
Thank you.